If this video showed up for you, it's because this story is going to move you and give you chills. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of story, and comment which city you're watching from. The late afternoon sun sliced through the sheer curtains of the suburban home, casting long, lazy beams of dust motes dancing in the golden light. The house was silent, that specific, heavy silence that only settles when a chaotic day finally takes a pause. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and fresh laundry, a scent of order and control. But for David and Lisa, control was a fragile thing, held together by a series of strict, non-negotiable rules. And the most important rule of all, the one written in invisible ink on every door frame and safety gate in the house, was simple. The pack never touches the boy. The pack consisted of 3 German Shepherd puppies, Rocco, Bear, and Duke. They were only 6 months old, but puppy felt like the wrong word for creatures that were rapidly growing into wolves. They were a whirlwind of oversized paws, sharp baby teeth, and boundless, clumsy energy. They didn't mean to be dangerous, they were just too much. Too big, too loud, too rough. On the other side of the spectrum was Ethan, 5 years old, with hair the color of wheat and a spirit as gentle as a dandelion puff. He was small for his age, still possessing that baby-fat fragility that makes parents instinctively hold their breath when the world gets too loud. David and Lisa looked at their son and saw glass. They looked at the dogs and saw hammers. The fear wasn't irrational. Just the week before, Bear had knocked over a solid oak end table just by wagging his tail too hard. What would that tail or those playful but heavy paws do to a sleeping 5-year-old? They don't know their own strength, David would say, checking the locks on the heavy metal safety gate that divided the living room from the hallway leading to the bedrooms. He would rattle the gate twice, a nervous tick born of paternal instinct. One jump, one accidental scratch, and he never finished the sentence. He didn't have to. Lisa felt the same knot of anxiety in her stomach every time the dogs wrestled near the barrier. But barriers are only as strong as the people who manage them. It was a Tuesday, the kind of day that feels indistinguishable from any other. The morning had been a marathon of chaos, spilled cereal, barking at the mailman, the endless cycle of sit, stay, down that the dogs only half listened to. By 2 p.m., the house had finally exhaled. Ethan, exhausted from a morning of building block towers, had drifted off to sleep in his room at the end of the hall. The dogs, seemingly spent from their morning patrols, were curled up in a heap of fur on the kitchen rug. Lisa took the opportunity to fold laundry in the living room. The rhythmic swish fold of fabric lulled her into a trance. David was in the garage, taking a quick call for work. The safety gate stood between the kitchen and the hallway leading to the bedrooms, the iron curtain that kept the worlds separate. But moments earlier, David had passed through that gate to grab a bottle of water. He had swung it shut behind him. He heard the clack of metal on metal, but he didn't hear the click of the lock engaging. It was a matter of millimeters. The latch hadn't seated fully. The gate looked closed, stood closed, but it was essentially a phantom wall. Back in the kitchen, Rocco's ears twitched. The leader of the trio, he was the first to wake up. He lifted his heavy head, sniffing the air. The scent of the house had changed. The man was in the garage. The woman was distracted by the warm clothes. And down the hall was the scent they were usually forbidden to investigate. The scent of milk and soap. The scent of the small one. Rocco stood up, his nails clicking softly against the linoleum. Bear and Duke followed, a unified organism of curiosity. They padded toward the date. Usually they would whine or scratch, but today something was different. Rocco nudged the metal bars with his wet nose.
The gate didn't resist. With a soft, rusty squeak that was drowned out by the humming of the dryer in the laundry room, the gate swung open just a few inches. It was enough. One by one, the 3 large shadows slipped through the gap. They moved with a predatory grace that betrayed their clumsy age. There was no barking, no chaotic scrambling. Just a silent, single-file mission into the forbidden territory of the hallway. Lisa finished folding a towel and placed it on the stack. She paused, frowning. She tilted her head, listening. Mothers have a sixth sense for silence. They know the difference between a peaceful silence and a mischievous one. The kitchen, usually filled with the heavy breathing and occasional snores of the shepherds, was completely quiet. "Rocco?" she called out softly, not wanting to wake Ethan. No answer, no jingle of a collar. She stood up, a sudden cold prickle running down her spine. She walked to the kitchen archway and stopped dead. The rug was empty. The back door was closed. Then she saw it. The safety gate. It was pushed open, leaving a gaping mouth leading into the dark hallway. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. "David!" she screamed, abandoning all volume control. "David! The dogs!" She didn't wait for an answer. She sprinted toward the hallway, her socks slipping on the hardwood floor. Every worst-case scenario flashed through her mind in a terrifying montage. Teeth, blood, the weight of a 60-pound animal crushing a small chest. She reached the hallway just as David burst in from the garage, phone still in hand, eyes wide with confusion that instantly morphed into terror when he saw the open gate. "Where are they?" he gasped. "Ethan's room," Lisa choked out, her voice barely a whisper. The door to Ethan's room, usually left ajar to let the air circulate, was pushed wide open. From where they stood at the start of the hall, they couldn't see the bed. They could only see the shadows stretching across the floor. But they could hear. They heard a low, guttural sound, a sound that made David's blood turn to ice. It was the sound of deep, heavy breathing, and then the wet, distinct sound of something being licked. David moved in front of Lisa, his jaw set, preparing himself for violence, preparing to do whatever he had to do to get those animals off his son. He took a step forward, the floorboard creaking under his weight like a gunshot in the silence. He reached the doorframe. He braced himself on the wood, his knuckles white, and swung himself around to look into the room. What he saw stopped his heart in his chest, but he still had no idea what waited behind that door.
David blinked, his brain refusing to process the image in front of him. He had expected violence. He had expected chaos. He had expected to see his son cowering in a corner or buried under a frenzy of teeth and claws. Instead, he saw stillness. The single twin bed, usually dominated by Ethan's Captain America duvet, was now a sea of black and tan fur. It looked less like a child's bed and more like a wolf's den. Rocco, the largest of the three, was curled in a tight crescent moon shape at the foot of the bed, his heavy chin resting on his front paws, eyes closed. Bear was stretched out along the side of the mattress, his body acting as a living guardrail, preventing anyone from rolling off. And Duke was the one that made David's breath hitch in his throat. The third puppy was lying directly next to Ethan. His massive, heavy head was resting gently on the boy's chest, rising and falling in perfect rhythm with Ethan's breathing. Ethan was completely invisible beneath the protective wall of muscle and fur, save for his face and one small hand. That hand, so fragile and pale, was buried deep into the thick fur of Duke's neck, gripping it loosely like a teddy bear. Lisa squeezed into the doorway beside David, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The sound died in her throat, replaced by a sharp intake of air that sounded like a sob. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling so hard it was barely audible. Is he breathing?" David squinted. The weight of the dog on Ethan's chest was substantial. A full-grown German Shepherd is heavy. A 6-month-old puppy who hasn't grown into his paws yet is a dense, clumsy weight.
If Duke shifted, if he decided to stand up and step on the boy. "He's breathing," David whispered back, pointing a shaking finger. "Look at Duke's head, it's moving up and down." But the relief was short-lived. The situation was a powder keg. They were intruders in their own son's room. The dynamic in the room had shifted. This wasn't a bedroom anymore. It was territory. And the pack was guarding its prize. "What do we do?" Lisa hissed, tears streaming down her face. "If we startle them, if we yell—" "We can't yell," David said, his voice steely, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "If they jump, they'll crush him. We have to be quiet. We have to lure them out." David took a slow, agonizing step into the room. The floorboard groaned. Instantly, 3 pairs of ears swiveled. Rocco's eyes snapped open. They weren't the goofy, playful eyes of the puppy playing fetch in the yard. They were amber, sharp, and alert. He didn't growl, but he lifted his head, fixing David with a stare that communicated a clear message. "Do not come closer." David froze, 1 foot in the air. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a primal electricity. The rule of the house had been broken, and now a new rule was being written in real time. Then, the worst possible thing happened. Ethan stirred. Perhaps it was the tension in the room, or perhaps just the end of his nap cycle, but the boy shifted. He groaned, a sleepy, high-pitched sound, and tried to roll over. "No, no!" Lisa prayed silently, clutching the doorframe until her knuckles turned white. Ethan's movement disturbed the equilibrium. Duke, the puppy resting on his chest, was jostled. The dog let out a low huff of annoyance and lifted his heavy head. He looked down at the small human squirming beneath him.
Ethan opened his eyes. He blinked once, twice, his vision clearing. He wasn't looking at the ceiling. He was looking directly into the wet brown eyes of Duke, whose nose was roughly 2 inches from his own. David's muscles coiled. He was ready to launch himself across the room, consequences be damned. He saw Ethan's eyes widen. He saw the boy's small chest intake a sharp breath. Here it comes, David thought. The scream, the panic, the bite. But the scream never came. Instead, Ethan's face, still soft with sleep, slowly transformed. The confusion melted away, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. His lips curled upward into a blissful, sleepy smile that reached his eyes. "Hi, puppy," Ethan whispered, his voice raspy. The tension in the room shattered like glass. Duke didn't bite, he didn't bark. He simply lowered his head and delivered a long, wet, sloppy lick right across Ethan's cheek, from chin to forehead. A high-pitched squeal of delight burst from the boy, a sound so full of joy it seemed to vibrate the walls. "You're tickling me," Ethan giggled, bringing both hands up to wrap them around the dog's massive neck, pulling the beast closer for a hug. Rocco and Bear, awakened by the giggle, didn't attack, they didn't defend, they simply joined in. Bear nudged Ethan's arm with a wet nose, whining softly for attention, while Rocco began frantically wagging his tail. The heavy thump, thump, thump against the mattress sounded like a heartbeat. David and Lisa stood in the doorway, paralyzed. The scene before them defied every fear, every warning, every instinct they had nurtured for months. They weren't witnessing a predator and prey. They were witnessing a reunion. It was as if the dogs had known all along that this small, fragile creature was the center of their pack. They hadn't broken in to hurt him. They had broken in because they couldn't stand to be separated from him any longer. David let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for an hour. He looked at Lisa. Her tears of terror had turned into tears of disbelief. "They're hugging him," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. David took a step forward, no longer trying to be silent. The dogs looked up at him. Rocco's ears went back, his tail thumping harder. The look in his eyes had changed again. It was no longer "stay back." It was, "Look what we found." "Hey, buddy," David said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan looked past the wall of fur, his eyes bright. "Daddy, look, they came to sleep with me." David walked to the side of the bed and sat down on the edge. The mattress dipped. Duke didn't move away. He just shifted to make room, resting his chin on David's knee, bridging the gap between the father and the son. "I see that, Ethan," David said, reaching out to stroke Duke's head. The fur was warm, living, and solid. "I see that." But as he watched his son bury his face into the dog's neck, David realized that the danger wasn't the dogs. The danger had been their own fear, keeping apart two forces that were destined to be together.
That evening, the screwdriver felt heavy in David's hand, but his grip was steady. The metal safety gate, the one that had stood as a fortress between the living room and the hallway for months, clattered to the floor. The sound echoed through the house, final and decisive. It wasn't just a piece of metal coming down. It was a wall of fear crumbling into dust. Lisa didn't protest. She stood in the kitchen doorway, watching him work. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but peaceful. Beside her, Rocco, Bear, and Duke sat in a calm row, watching David with focused intensity. They didn't try to run past him. They didn't need to force their way in anymore. They knew the barrier was gone. From that day on, the dynamic of the house shifted entirely. The pack didn't just accept Ethan. They appointed themselves his personal Secret Service detail. If Ethan walked to the backyard to chase butterflies, 3 large shadows moved in perfect synchronization with him. If he sat on the rug to watch cartoons, he was never sitting on the floor. He was using Bear as a pillow, his feet propped up on Duke, while Rocco kept watch at the window. David and Lisa watched with a mixture of awe and humility. They realized they had spent months worrying about the strength of the dog's jaws, completely underestimating the size of their hearts. They had worried the dogs would knock Ethan over. And sure, there were bumps and scrapes. There were muddy paw prints on clean shirts, and sloppy licks that messed up hair. But there was also a confidence growing in Ethan that hadn't been there before. He wasn't the fragile boy made of glass anymore. He was the boy who ran with wolves. He walked taller. He spoke louder. He knew with the absolute certainty that only a child can have that he was never, ever alone. One afternoon, months later, David looked out the window. It was raining, a gray, miserable drizzle. But in the yard, Ethan was sitting under the big oak tree, wearing his yellow raincoat. He wasn't playing. He was just sitting there, looking sad, perhaps upset about a broken toy or a scolding he had received earlier. But he wasn't crying alone. Rocco and Bear were lying on the wet grass on either side of him, soaking up the rain so he wouldn't feel the cold wind. And Duke? Duke was sitting directly in front of Ethan, his massive head resting on Ethan's small knees, staring up into the boy's face with a look of such profound adoration that it made David's chest ache. Ethan was whispering to the dog, and for the first time, David understood. There are things a child can't tell his parents. Fears, little sadnesses, secrets that feel too big for a 5-year-old voice. But they can tell a dog. A dog listens with its whole soul. A dog doesn't judge, it just loves. David realized then that his job wasn't to protect Ethan from the world by keeping him in a bubble. His job was to make sure Ethan had the right companions to face the world with. The parents had thought they were saving the puppies when they adopted them from the shelter. They thought they were the heroes of this story. But looking at their son, safe and loved in the center of that furry circle, they knew the truth. Those dogs hadn't just been rescued. They had been recruited. Life is full of doors we are afraid to open. We build gates, we set rules, and we let fear dictate the boundaries of our love. We look at the big dogs in our lives, the risks, the changes, the unknowns, and we only see the teeth. We forget to look for the tail wag. David and Lisa learned that the greatest protection you can give someone isn't isolation, it's connection. Because, in the end, love is the only thing strong enough to be gentle. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and share it with someone who loves animals. And remember, sometimes the guardians we need don't look like angels. Sometimes they have 4 legs, wet noses, and hearts way too big for their bodies. See you in the next story.